We're both part of the Anchor Point group. Charlie founded this through her hard work over the COVID period. And this is an organisation I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. Charlie, is there anything else that you would like to add before we move on?
I don't think. I think probably just worth saying. I hope this is like a conversation. So I know it's a webinar. It always feels a bit formal, but you know, Ali and I work really closely together. We meet every week, don't we, for one thing and another. So I'm kind of hoping that this is much more of a dialogue between us, and obviously there'll be a chance to have some dialogue with people that have dialed in. I also just need to mention that I am in a hotel at a conference, and I'm hoping nobody comes in and disturbs me. But if that happens, then I'll just have to deal with that. Okay.
The joys of online digital work. So as Charlie said, hopefully we'll have a bit of a conversation as we're going through. And although we are taking a Q&A at the end, if there's anything specific that you want to ask going through that's worth us addressing while we're presenting, then we're absolutely fine to do that as well. So the one thing that Tamsin didn't say, and I think is probably quite important for putting this into context today, is that as well as my professional experience, I am also somebody with lived experience of brain injury myself. So my brother had a road traffic accident back in the 90s, which left him with a severe traumatic brain injury. So I have a personal vested interest in this particular area. And also, hopefully, as you will see, it gives me perhaps a different insight into what it's like for family members after brain injury. While every experience is different, and certainly mine isn't necessarily reflective of everyone's, I think there are some similarities that we're going to touch upon today. So one of the things that we were just going to start with was going through some of the sort of data that we know about around carers' experience and family members' experiences after brain injury. So we're in a situation at the moment where there's still very unclear figures about just how many family members there are out there that are affected by this, not least because we don't really fully understand yet how many people are affected by brain injury. So the best guess that we can go for is that we know that there are about 5.4 million people in England who are named as unpaid carers that are friends or family members. And also Headway UK have stated that there's about 59% of carers within the ABI population that are experiencing some form of difficulty, about 21% experiencing severe depression. So we don't know how many of that 5.4 million are represented in brain injury alone, but given that we are talking about a large population of people with brain injuries, it's likely to be significant. So what we see is that about 60% of individuals who care for someone with a brain injury, so family members or friends, state that they feel that they're not receiving adequate support to help them in that particular set of caring duties. What people report is high burdens of care, so experiencing a degree of burnout because of the responsibilities of caring for a loved one. Poor mental health, I've already touched upon depression as being a key outcome here, but other things include high levels of stress, high levels of anxiety, and a general lowered quality of life, and a degree of emotional distress that goes alongside this. We also know that about 24% of individuals feel satisfied with their own healthcare needs. So this is something that doesn't just affect individuals in terms of their day-to-day life, it also impacts on their own health, physical health as well. And actually about 8% report feeling very dissatisfied with their own physical health. So we've got a range of different difficulties here. And as we're going through, we're going to start touching on it more from a lived experience perspective, from what we know of the work that we've been doing, but also from my own personal experience as well. Charlie, is there anything you'd like to add before we move on?
Yeah, so I think, you know, you've candidly shared your lived experience. I think I always like to start from the fact that I don't have lived experience, and I sometimes, you know, I'm not an expert in this stuff. Like my clinical experience was in neurosurgery. I saw how families were struggling, and then that has become kind of my lifelong interest in how we can understand the needs of family members and then use that understanding to improve how family members are supported, because that narrative about, there's nothing for family members, or, falling off a cliff once they've been discharged from hospital. We haven't really seen a seismic move in that narrative, over decades. So that's kind of, but I always start by saying, I'm not an expert. So if I say anything in any of this presentation that you don't agree with me, you can say I'm learning all the time. And I think, Ali's been very clear about some of the headlines, and certainly in research, and the things that make people listen are the rates of things like clinical depression, anxiety, reduced quality of life, and they're quite stark outcome measures. And actually, sometimes in some of the work that I do, so I'm a qualitative researcher by trade, and this means that I spend time with people, I listen to their stories, I try and understand what life feels like on the inside for people. So sometimes as researchers, we can be a bit lazy and we can measure things that we can see on the outside, but that doesn't always reflect how people feel on the inside. And that's really important. And a lot of the people that I speak with talk about much more nuanced feelings around their role and their relationship with the survivor, but also like their relationship with themselves. So we talk a lot about identity loss as not as a result of a consequence of organic damage from a brain injury, but as a carer, what that feels like to actually lose yourself, and that feeling kind of, displacing of yourself, and just that uneasy feeling of nothing works the same anymore. I don't feel the same. I don't look the same. I don't behave the same. And actually what I find is people have spent a long time not voicing a lot of those feelings, because the primary role has been to support that family member to maximize their recovery. And then actually the family member may wake up, kind of 7 years down the line and realize that they lost themselves that day as well. So a lot of our work is trying to think, how do family members kind of reconnect to that part of their identity? And also things that again are harder to kind of measure, but things like, what does hope look like in the context of brain injury? What does feeling hopeful look like? What's the relevance of things like post-traumatic growth? So like, how do people find a meaning from what is the most devastating set of circumstances, and how does that then generate a new life, new circumstances? So I think it's being in the grey. I like this grey area of trying to understand what life feels like, and that's different for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, that's a key part of the work that both of us do, is about trying to unpick that deeper narrative, the nuanced picture, rather than looking specifically at those headline figures, which sum it up but don't necessarily give that experience, that story of what that looks like on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shall I introduce? So just
yes.
introduce this video. So hopefully the video works. And just wanted to say, this is a video that we did following my PhD. It's specifically on family members after traumatic brain injury, but the stories that I hear and the people that I talk to would say this resonates kind of across the sector. So I hope that you find that meaningful, even though it's just specifically on TBI.
Okay, let's hope that it works.
Thanks, Sally. And then just to reflect, the kind of key point of that video really is just that sense of, you know, families are not in a, I always think this term, a well-functioning family, is a really interesting like label, isn't it? And actually families are always in excuse me, families are always in a state of flux, aren't they? Like there's always a milestone, there's always some change happening. And actually, whilst the brain injury is, it causes a huge ripple in that family, there's other stuff going on, and quite often those things are more subtle, they're being missed. You know, children are reaching milestones of GCSEs, A levels, they're leaving home, they're, you know, parents are getting divorced, elderly parents are, you know, need more care. So it's just this understanding the complexity of families is so important in this area.
Absolutely. It's very easy to view these things within a vacuum, but actually this life experience is not happening within a vacuum. There's plenty of other things that go alongside.
Yeah. So on this slide, we just wanted to just make the statement really that we work closely with Dr. Mark Holloway, and he would always say, you know, if you've met one person with brain injury, you've met one person with brain injury, and that, you know, that transcends to family. If you've met one family, you've met one family. So actually all the, you know, everything is so, every family is unique. The injuries are unique. The consequences are unique. So you could almost think that actually there's nothing the same about those, but actually what we do find, there are some similarities in people's unique stories, and we would recommend these two books for family members to read, and in those they share these similar kinds of themes of trauma, grief, burden and isolation, and we're just going to unpack those on the next slide.
So I'm going to start by trying to unpack this idea of trauma and ongoing trauma. So, I mean, trauma can mean lots of different things to lots of different people, and people respond very differently to trauma. But ultimately, when we think about it in this context, we start off with a very, in some ways, very traditional way of viewing trauma, that a traumatic event has happened. Now, that may look very different to a lot of different people. So obviously, there's a range of different kinds of brain injuries. So the event itself is going to look different. It may be a very sudden incident, like an example of TBI, for example, or even stroke, or it might be something a bit more sort of gradual in things like direct brain tumors, where there's been a degree of decline perhaps, or change in cognitive functioning before that diagnosis is actually made. But regardless of how that process happens, there is that initial trauma that people experience, quite often punctuated by lots of hospital visits, may even be hospital stays for the individual with the brain injury themselves. And family members often are not only overlooked at this particular point, but often bear the brunt of it. So for a lot of people with brain injuries, they may not remember those very early stages when they're in hospital, for example. Whereas for family, those memories are absolutely acute to them. They are there, they're present, they know what's going on around them. And those experiences of being in that hospital environment can be pretty traumatic in their own right. And certainly, Charlie, that was your experience, wasn't it, coming at it from an intensive care perspective? So we start off with this initial trauma, which is also then punctuated by this idea of hope. So obviously, family members are praying, wishing, hoping that their family member is going to pull through, that they're going to get better, that there's going to be some kind of positive change. And at this point, people are looking for every sign, every demonstration that there is some kind of a positive hope for the future. What comes next then is quite often a very busy, chaotic period where there's a lot of potentially rehabilitation, a lot of work going on to support that person to a point where they might be ready to leave hospital, or getting back into daily life in some kind of way. And what we tend to see here initially is a period of almost stability. And I use the term loosely because it's not at all a stable time. There's a lot going on, a lot of adjustments that are being made. But I think for a lot of people, and certainly this is what people talk about in therapeutic environment, but also in research, is there's actually a lot of relief about leaving that hospital environment, about being able to go home and trying to live a more normal existence. So that's what I mean by stability. But then gradually, over time, reality then starts to hit that actually the family dynamics have fundamentally changed in some way, that this individual that has now come back into the family home is different in some way to the person that they were before. And that life is not going to look exactly as it did before. And I think for me, in my therapeutic work, that's always the most difficult thing I've seen for family members, is that there's quite often a sense of believing that things will go back to normal. And then it sometimes takes quite a long time for people to reconcile that maybe actually things won't, that there will be a change, that things aren't going to be exactly as they were before. And it's about how to make sense of that. And as Charlie was saying, part of that's looking at identity, thinking about how we then move forward as family members in our new roles and in a new life for ourselves. I hate that term new normal, but actually it probably fits quite nicely here. Unfortunately, that's not a stable new existence, a stable new normal. So for many family members, after brain injury happens, there's lots of ongoing traumas that actually feed into that sense of trauma that's experienced from that early stage. So this may be daily things, like, for example, fighting for access for benefits would be a really good example of something that can be quite traumatizing for people. It might be trying to know the right people to talk to within organizations to get the kind of support and help that they need, which can be frustrating and incredibly traumatizing. But then there are also the aspects of the brain injury itself that can cause difficulties. So some of those more difficult behavioral changes or emotional changes in the person with the brain injury can be pretty traumatic for family members to live with, especially if that person is very different from who they were perhaps prior to the injury. And when we think about it from a psychological point of view, what we see in the trauma literature is that individuals that experience some kind of a catastrophic trauma, some people cope really well with that, others less so. But generally speaking, people tend to do quite well given time and space and resources to support them in that process. What people actually don't do quite so well at is that ongoing drip feed effect of small traumas that are happening day to day. And that's particularly problematic when you're in a situation where you aren't experiencing any kind of support or input, that potentially you don't have the time to be able to actually look after yourself in any real way. And so what happens is that emotional trauma builds up inside of individuals and have the risk of bursting at some point in the future. And there's never really a safe time, a safe space in order to park that. So, and I think probably Charlie and I will talk about this in a bit, is this idea of people feeling quite often that this isn't their story to tell, that it's the story of the person with the brain injury, because the focus, particularly in the early stages of care, has always been around that person. So there's a sense of, and I'll come on to talking about this in a minute, this idea of what we call disenfranchised grief, that actually this isn't something that they should be experiencing or feeling. And that can then add to this ongoing process of trauma, that it feels like people feel like, sorry, that they don't have the time, the space to deal with these traumatic events, to process the things that have happened to them. And actually even scratching the surface potentially of those feelings may be quite scary, quite dangerous for people to consider, because actually they've got to continue to live with that person and live this new existence moving forward. I'm going to go on to talk about grief in a moment, but Charlie, is there anything you wanted to add to that before I move on?
Sorry. Yeah, just to emphasize what's interesting, when I speak to lots of psychologists who are working directly with family members, and they would talk about their approaches as doing that through a lens of trauma. And actually, I think that's a really good starting point for anybody who's trying to work with family members, because actually it's the trauma that is the catalyst for everything. And And it's interesting when we clinically, when we look, when we're caring for brain injury survivors, you can't do anything about the primary injury apart from public health messaging and seatbelts and things like that. That's kind of that's happened. And clinically, everything you do after is about preventing secondary trauma. And actually, I think it's the same in a pathway for family members. We can't do anything about the fact that your loved one has had this traumatic injury, but the amount of trauma that the systems create for family members who are already, they're on this pathway, they're dealing for a lifetime, all of the complexity around, where you talk about loss, change, adaptation, all of those things. The one thing they don't need is extra trauma caused by the system that's supposed to help them. And that's the bit that I hear so often from family members. And that's quite often the bit that they can't resolve, because these people are supposed to help them, but they're not helping them. They're making it worse because they're pushed out, they're ignored, they're treated like the bad family, whereas actually they're just advocating for their loved one. And wouldn't we all do the same thing?
Absolutely, yeah, and as you say, I've heard many a professional make that comment about oh, the family's very difficult, they're very challenging to work with. And what they mean by challenging is that they are challenging the care that their loved one and they are receiving, and that's absolutely fine and appropriate for them to do so.
For sure.
So then moving on to grief. So this term ambiguous loss is quite a complex one, and it means lots of different things in lots of different contexts. But ultimately what it means is experiencing a sense of grief for somebody that is still present in some way. And we use this a lot when we think about the idea of brain injury, both for the person who has the brain injury, so they quite often feel a sense of ambiguous loss because they're experiencing a loss of the person who they were prior to their injury. But it also relates to family members in that they may well have this experience of feeling a sense of grief for the person that they knew before, whilst having to live day to day with this new person that they're having to come to terms with as being their loved one. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail with this because I'm very aware of time. But this is the Kubler-Ross model, which is one of the more basic and easy to understand principles of the grief journey. So it's this idea that in any grieving process, be it a standard one or ambiguous loss, we go through these different processes of grieving. We quite often start in a point of denial, not believing that this is happening, hoping that it's not happening, moving to a sense of anger. Why is this happening to me? Why has this happened to us? Through to this sort of bargaining, so praying that things change, that things will be different in some way. That's quite often followed by a period of depression where actually that resignation kicks in, the feeling that this is real, this has happened, there's nothing I can do to change it. But actually, it's not necessarily a positive feeling, which is why it quite often leads to a sense of depression. And then ultimately leading to a point of acceptance. Now, I think the first thing that's really important to note about this model is that it's not linear. So the idea is not that we necessarily go through each of these stages in some kind of straightforward pattern. Actually, grief doesn't look like that. It's much more like a confused ball of string, and we tend to pinball back and forth between these different parts of the cycle as we gradually start to understand what's happened to us. The bit we want to reach, though, is that point of acceptance. And again, the important thing to stress about this is that this is not about grief being over necessarily. Actually, grief is something that continues with us for life, but it's about learning where to put that grief within the context of the rest of one's life and the rest of one's identity.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Ali.
And it's a really useful model for thinking about that experience that family members are quite often going through, trying to adjust to this new person that they're now with.
And I think just to add that, those two words, acceptance and adjustment, I think sometimes they can feel like very hard outcomes and very difficult things to, like an unobtainable, like, why haven't you adjusted yet? Whereas actually a lot of the work that we do it's more about the processes of adjustment. They are processes to be worked through. And some days you'll feel more adjusted than other days, and that will
That's
depend
right.
on all the things that are around you, the systems that you're existing in, or something else, something new, something different. And also, when we're talking about grief and loss and understanding the change of the injured person, there's also then grief for yourself, you know,
Yeah.
and things that you've lost, and you know, the future that you decided that was going to be yours. So it's such a, you know, I think your metaphor of like this ball of wool instead of this linear process, and you jump from different bits to different days. And sometimes you'll feel better than others, and it's trying over time, having more of those good days than the bad days. That's what you're working towards.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right that there's also that the grief associated with what the person themselves has lost through the changes, that also then feeds into this process. And that's quite often the thing that will trigger people to go back through the cycle, just at a point when they think actually that they're learning to accept this in whatever way that looks like. And I think the other important thing here is thinking about what we call complicated griefs, this idea that the more factors that are involved in a grieving process that complicate it, the more difficult it is to get to the end of this cycle and be able to accept it in its all its form. And actually, some of what you were saying before about how difficult the systems and the people around this can make it for family members, all those things will feed back into making this more difficult and taking much, much longer. So it's not common to see people still going through this process years post-injury. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, or that may be slightly bad timing for you.
Yeah, so we put this word burden of care, I think, just because it's a really interesting word, the word burden. And it makes sense as an external person looking at this situation. Often talk about burden. The literature certainly is full of burden and burden outcome measures, and how do we measure the impact on a family member? Well, they're burdened by it, but when you speak to family members, they don't commonly use the term burden. And actually, it's much more, especially when somebody has that injury, you give up your life to do everything that you can possibly do to secure a positive outcome for that person. And whether that looks like burden, or whether that looks like commitment, that looks like love, that looks like meaningful relationships. At some point, though, quite often, that commitment and that dedication can feel like a weight endured over a long period of time. And again, it makes me, I work with researchers who look at the idea of long term as being 6 months, a year, 2 years. And actually, in this field, we're talking 7, 10, 20, 30 years for some of this stuff to come out. And that's quite often because there hasn't been a platform, there hasn't been a means to actually realize how much you've been affected by these circumstances. And that's where we start, that I think that's, I don't know whether the right title, but there's it comes out in some form later on. And quite often that's because your stories are quite often that there's no platform for them. It's very difficult to say, well, I've been affected too. And you're looking after somebody that's just had a devastating injury, but actually not having that platform to be able to say, this is my story, this is how I've been affected, I lost my future too, I lost my husband, or I lost my career, and actually making room for that, but then also trying to work in ways that you make that life still purposeful and meaningful and hopeful. So we turn that kind of burden into something positive, and some way of still finding joy in life, meaning in life, despite what is hopefully the worst thing that'll ever happen to a family.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's as you say, the word burden doesn't always resonate well with people, as does the word care, I think, too, here, that even that is something that people struggle with. And I myself, it probably took me a very long time, probably not even till I was sort of 10, 15 years after my brother's accident, to really appreciate that the role that I had played was one of a carer. It hadn't occurred to me that that was what was happening. So yeah, it's a difficult area. So let's move on. So then, thinking about what people need in terms of support. I mean, I think we've already covered quite a bit of it in terms of understanding, patience, actually being included in conversations is a really good starting point. So I think one of the first things that I've put at the beginning here is around information and support. So we still see a situation where quite often families are leaving hospital without any real useful information about what this is going to look like for them, what the possible difficulties they might experience might be, and probably most importantly, where they can go to seek support if they need it, which they almost certainly will at some point. There's the comment I'm aware of in the chat here about communicating to friends and family about the difficulties, and especially when you've got a loved one who doesn't want to talk about their own particular difficulties or doesn't want anyone else knowing. And I guess this relates very nicely to this next point around hear my voice, that actually family members do have a right to talk about this as being their own story too, because as we said with that ripples idea, this doesn't happen just to the individual. They may be the one that has had the injury itself, but actually the impact of that will have huge ripples across the entire family, more so for some individuals than others. And actually it's about being able to take some ownership over that, and having professionals around also take ownership of that, and accepting that family members need to be included where appropriate, rather than excluded from conversations. We talk a lot in our research about this idea of social connection, that actually being part of a community is a really important thing for people with brain injury, but also for family members too, so that they have other areas that they could call on for support. So that becomes particularly difficult if you've got caring responsibilities, and that's certainly where things like the local headway groups are particularly useful, to be able to give a safe space for somebody with brain injury to go. But actually from a family perspective, that may be the only few hours somebody has a week where they've actually got time to go and do the shopping on their own, for example. Is really important. Or go and have a coffee with friends and just unwind, unload in the way that people need to. We've touched on this in terms of benefits already, but this idea of the right to equality, that actually people are generally unpaid for the work they do. They find it very difficult to access things like carer's allowance, for example. Again, referring to the comment in the text about the invisibility of brain injury, that comes with its own difficulties when it comes to things like claiming welfare benefits, because it's not really recognised. The caring responsibilities that go alongside it aren't recognised in quite the same way as it might be if you were supporting someone to wash or dress or to cook for themselves. And that nicely covers the second point, that actually we've got a condition here that's is broadly invisible, and then within that you've got the family members that actually sit even more invisible within that picture. And as from a professional point of view, it's really something that we want to see, that professionals start to actually see these other individuals that are within this picture and actually talk about them to them in that way. And that means actually appreciating their identity in their own right. So the other thing that we quite often see in the research field, and Charlie and I sort of hold our head in our hands a lot of the time about this, is talking about, well, it's important to support families because they'll support the needs of the person with the brain injury. Well, yes, that's true. And yes, that's really important. But actually, we're people too, and we have a right to have our own needs met and our own identity supported too. So Charlie, do you want to, where we're running massively, apologies.
Well, I think, I mean, we'll just talk briefly about it. So I think really just like Ali was saying about, we hold our head in our hands, really the idea of anchor point came from that kind of just sense of frustration that actually, and it's so important that, you know, as an academic, that you do research because it matters to you, because you're interested in it, because you want to create change. And then you realize you're having the same conversations with the same people like a decade later and nothing's changing. And COVID just gave us an opportunity to just sit in an online space together. I just said, well, you know, what would happen? Instead of meeting at conferences and chatting about the same stuff, let's meet together and just see what happens. And that was really the birth of Anchor Point. And I've been so blessed. We've been so blessed to work with, you know, such amazing people. And it's taken us a long time to figure out our own identity. We're not a family support group. Our ambition is to create change and drive change in this sector. And we do that through a number of different working groups. So we're essentially an unincorporated charity, and we, as a group, want to drive change so that families can live their best life with ABI. And on the next slide, I think you'll see. Oh, have we got time to play this? I don't. It was we created that. We thought we just might give a bit of context to Anchor Point and why we exist, and we did this for I think the 2 years ago Headway Brain Injury Awareness campaign, the 90 seconds campaign. So it should be about 90 seconds. Shall we play it? So I hope that gives you a bit of an overview of why we started Anchor Point. I think, were you going to do these slides? I can't remember.
I'm happy for you to. It's fine.
Yeah. So obviously we have our mission, we've got a mission statement. We are on lots of different social media, and we've just launched our website, which is very exciting. So we're now at anchorpointabi.org, and it's important to say that we are a collaborative organisation. Like we collaborate, and we are, you know, proudly affiliated with a number of different organisations, including obviously Headway UK and local Headway groups as well. And we're trying to achieve our mission through particular, what we call them working groups. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have what we do: research, information, policy, practice, lives, education, and strategy, which helpfully is the RIPPLES acronym. And that just gives us a focus. So if you pop onto our website, have a look. It is a mixed, it's for professionals, it's for family members. There's a few resources on there. We're building as we go. We're taking some feedback. We'll have a proper launch of the website soon. We're just kind of ironing out a few glitches, but I think that's our ambition, to have a publicly facing, useful repository for resources which are just for families, and for this, and that's something that doesn't exist anymore. Not anymore. It's normally that the families there's family material in resources which are predominantly for the ABI survivor, and we wanted something which was a space to talk specifically about the impact on family members.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the key thing about that is that because so often that voice is lost, it's important that we do have a sort of separate place where that can be, albeit a lot of it is signposting to things like Headway UK's website, but that's also that's also
but then that's really good, because I think also, but our role is to work with, we always said at the beginning, if somebody's doing this and doing it well, we don't need to, we just work with people that are already doing it. And actually part of our job is to work with people like Headway, and look at family facing resources, and look at what's missing, perhaps how can resources be improved, or how could we maybe put some research evidence behind some of them. So that's what, the collaboration is one of our core values, and we're really grateful to organisations like Headway to help us along our journey as well.